Welcome, weary traveller, to the tragic tale of Morgott, the Omen king whose devotion knew no bounds. Tonight, we shall walk through the shadows of the lands between, following the path of a soul born cursed, yet blessed with unwavering faith. This is a story of kingdoms built on golden light, of children cast into darkness, and of love that endures despite rejection. So settle into your rest, let the weight of the day drift away, and allow your mind to wander through this melancholy legend. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us begin this gentle journey into shadow and gold. In the depths beneath the golden city of Lindell, where the light of the Erd tree had never touched stone, and the air hung thick with the weight of forgotten sorrows, two small figures huddled in chambers that had been carved not for comfort but for containment. The shunning grounds stretched through countless tunnels and caverns beneath the capital, a vast network of imprisonment that few above even knew existed. Yet, it was here that the most shameful secrets of the golden lineage were buried like infected wounds that refused to heal. Morgott and his twin brother Mog had known no world beyond these suffocating depths, their entire existence confined to spaces barely large enough for their growing bodies, their limbs bound by golden fetters that bore the ancient symbol of the crucible. These were not mere chains but instruments of divine rejection, crafted from the same sacred metal that blessed the citizens above, while serving here only to remind the imprisoned of their cursed nature. The magical bindings drew their power from the very Erd tree that towered overhead, a constant reminder that even the source of all grace had turned its back upon them. The fetters themselves were marvels of cruel engineering, their golden surface etched with patterns that had once represented divine blessing, but now served only to channel suffering. They drew tight around wrists and ankles with each movement, their weight increasing whenever the twins attempted to struggle against their bonds. The magic within them was alive in its own terrible way, responding to defiance with greater restriction and to acceptance with a relief so slight it barely qualified as mercy. As the years passed in this underground purgatory, the physical symptoms of their curse grew more pronounced with each season that turned overhead. Morgott's horns, which had begun as small protrusions barely visible beneath his infant flesh, now pushed through his skin with a violence that left permanent welts and infected sores around each point of emergence. The bone itself seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, growing not in patterns that might be manageable but in twisted spirals that served no purpose beyond causing maximum discomfort to their unwilling host. The right side of his face bore the worst of this cruel sculpture, where multiple horns had grown so close together that they blocked his vision almost completely, in a desperate attempt to preserve some measure of sight. The Sheikah, who occasionally tended to the royal prisoners, had performed a crude surgery, cutting away enough horn to allow one eye to function properly. The operation had been performed without any consideration for pain, viewed more as maintenance of a valuable prisoner than as an act of mercy toward a suffering child. The remnants of those severed horns still crowded his right eye socket, creating a perpetual twilight in his vision that served as a constant reminder of what he was and what he would never be allowed to become. The surgical scars had never healed properly, leaving raised ridges of flesh that wept constantly and attracted infections that no amount of crude medical attention seemed able to cure permanently. But the horns were merely the most visible manifestation of a curse that ran far deeper than flesh and bone. Morgott's joints ached with a pain that seemed to originate from within the marrow itself, as if his very skeleton was at war with the body that contained it. His movements were stiff and painful, each step a negotiation between will and the rebellion of his own form. Simple actions that other children performed without thought became exercises in endurance for the young prince trapped beneath the capital. His skin, once soft as any infant's, had become a landscape of infection and irritation. Patches of fur sprouted randomly across his body, coarse and matted, following no pattern that suggested any natural purpose. These growths itched constantly, but scratching only opened new wounds that refused to heal in the damp, fetid air of the underground chambers. The smell of infection became such a constant companion that Morgott eventually ceased to notice it, though it served as yet another barrier between him and any possibility of normal human contact. Sleep, when it came at all, brought no relief from the torments of waking life. The curse that twisted his body also corrupted his dreams, filling them with visions and voices that belonged to other minds, other souls that seemed to share space within his consciousness. Ancient memories that were not his own played out behind his closed eyes, showing him glimpses of lives lived in ages past, deaths suffered by creatures whose names he did not know, but whose agonies he felt as if they were his own experiences. These dream spirits were not content to remain passive inhabitants of his sleeping mind. They whispered constantly, their voices creating a cacophony of wants and needs and hungers that bore no relation to anything Morgott himself desired. Some begged for release from their imprisonment within his consciousness. Others demanded that he embrace the violence and chaos that they insisted was his true nature. A few simply screamed, their wordless cries of anguish echoing through his thoughts during the few moments when he might otherwise have found peace. The heat that burned constantly in his blood was perhaps the most maddening aspect of his condition. A fever that never broke but never quite reached the point where it might kill him and end his suffering. His veins felt as though liquid fire flowed through them, making every heartbeat a small agony that reminded him of the cursed power he carried within his royal lineage. This was not the clean, purposeful heat of a forge or a hearth, but something corrupt and diseased that offered no warmth or comfort, only the constant suggestion that madness would be a welcome relief from consciousness. Above their subterranean prison, the sounds of Lanedel's golden age filtered down through stone and earth like the distant music of a celebration to which they would never be invited. During the early years of their imprisonment, when hope had not yet been completely crushed beneath the weight of abandonment, Morgott and Mog would press their ears to the walls and ceiling, trying to make sense of the muffled sounds that spoke of a world they could barely imagine. The voices of merchants calling their wares in the great marketplace reached them as whispers, transformed by distance and stone into something that sounded almost like prayers. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones became a rhythmic percussion that marked the passage of days and seasons, while the occasional fanfare of horns announced victories and celebrations that the twins could only wonder about in the darkness of their confinement. When their father Godfrey returned from his various campaigns of conquest, the celebrations above would last for days, the sounds of revelry and triumph filtering down to them like salt rubbed into wounds that would never heal. They could hear the cheers of crowds welcoming home their conquering hero, the music and dancing that accompanied feasts they would never taste, the laughter of children who had never known imprisonment or rejection by the very forces that should have cherished them. During these celebrations, Morgott would sometimes imagine what it might be like to stand beside his father as a son should, to receive the approval and affection that seemed to flow so freely to others in their family. He would picture himself dressed in fine robes instead of the rough sackcloth that was all his captors provided, standing tall and proud instead of hunched in pain from his various physical ailments. These fantasies were perhaps crueler than the reality of his situation, for they showed him exactly what he was missing and could never hope to attain. The sound of his brother Godwin training in the castle courtyards was particularly torturous, the ring of sword against sword, and the shouted instructions of weapons masters, creating a symphony of martial glory that spoke of a life lived in the light of divine favor. Morgott could hear the pride in their instructors' voices as they praised Godwin's progress, the easy camaraderie between the Golden Prince and his teachers, the casual way that respect and admiration were offered to one who had been born worthy of them. These sounds from the world above were not limited to celebrations and training. Morgott learned to interpret the rhythms of daily life in Lanedale, the way morning brought the bustle of servants beginning their work, how afternoon carried the sounds of craftsmen at their trades, and how evening settled into the gentler noises of families gathering for meals and rest. Each of these ordinary moments represented a normalcy that was as foreign to him as the most exotic tales from distant lands. When diplomatic visitors arrived at the castle, their exotic accents and unfamiliar languages created a tapestry of sound that spoke of a world far larger than the confines of his underground cell. Zora delegations brought with them the subtle music of flowing water that seemed to follow their graceful movements. Goron representatives announced themselves with voices that rumbled like distant thunder, while Rito messengers could be identified by the whisper of wind that accompanied their arrival and departure. Most painful of all were the sounds of his mother's voice during court ceremonies, her words carrying the authority and wisdom that marked her as a goddess among mortals. Marika's pronunciation of judgments and decrees reached him as fragments of divine poetry, each syllable perfectly formed and weighted with meanings that shaped the lives of countless subjects. To hear that voice, which should have whispered lullabies and words of comfort to him as a child, instead speaking of laws and policies that made no provision for his existence, was a reminder of abandonment that cut deeper than any physical wound. The marriage ceremony between Marika and Radagon created sounds unlike any the twins had heard before, the solemnity and joy of the occasion filtering down to them as a complex harmony of voices and instruments that spoke of love and unity and hope for the future. For hours they listened to wedding songs and speeches of congratulation, to the sounds of dancing and celebration that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their family's history. Not once during those festivities did any voice mention the existence of the two royal children locked away beneath the joy, as if they had never been born at all. During the quieter times, when the castle above settled into the rhythms of sleep and rest, other sounds became audible through the stone and earth that separated them from the world of the living. Sometimes they could hear the distant howling of wind through the castle's towers, a sound that spoke of vastness and freedom in ways that made their confined spaces feel even smaller and more suffocating. Rain pattering against windows far overhead created a gentle percussion that hinted at the existence of weather and seasons that passed unmarked in their timeless prison. The tolling of bells marked hours and days and special occasions, their bronze voices carrying temporal significance that was both precious and meaningless to those who lived outside the normal flow of time. Morgott learned to count these bells, to use their regular rhythm as a way of organizing his thoughts and maintaining some connection to the passage of time in a place where day and night held no meaning. The bells became his calendar, his clock, and sometimes his only companion during the longest periods of solitude. As the years accumulated like dust on the floors of their prison, Morgott began to distinguish between different types of celebrations and ceremonies. Victory fanfares had their own particular sound, different from religious festivals, which in turn were unlike the more intimate celebrations that marked birthdays and personal milestones. He became an expert in the acoustics of emotion, able to identify whether the sounds from above spoke of genuine joy or mere diplomatic necessity, of triumph earned through valor, or success achieved through political maneuvering. The night his father was banished from the lands between created a different kind of sound entirely, or perhaps more accurately, it created the absence of expected sound. There were no battle cries or clashing weapons, no sounds of struggle or defiance. Instead, there was simply a quietness that spoke of acceptance and obedience, followed by the gradual fading of familiar voices and footsteps as the Godfrey and his retinue departed from Lanedale forever. Morgott waited for days for some sign that his father might return. that the departure had been temporary or ceremonial, but the sounds that reached him spoke only of a castle adjusting to permanent absence. It was during these quiet times that another visitor began to appear in the shunning grounds, though the nature of these visits remained mysterious to the imprisoned twins for many years. Rollo, the renowned perfumer, had been granted access to the royal prisoners as part of his research into the nature of Omen curses, his scientific curiosity overriding the usual prohibitions against contact with the condemned. His footsteps had a different quality than those of guards or servants, lighter and more purposeful, carrying with them the subtle fragrances of the exotic materials he used in his craft. Rollo's visits brought with them the first genuine conversations Morgott had experienced with anyone outside his immediate situation. The perfumer was not interested in judgment or punishment, but rather in understanding the mechanisms by which the Omen curse manifested its effects on both body and mind. His questions were clinical, but not unkind, seeking to map the territories of suffering without adding to them unnecessarily. Through these conversations, Morgott began to understand that his condition was not unique, that other omens existed throughout the lands between and shared similar afflictions. The knowledge that he was not alone in his suffering provided a strange sort of comfort, even as it raised disturbing questions about the scope of the problem and the methods being developed to address it. Rollo spoke carefully about his work developing techniques and tools for dealing with omens, never quite stating directly what these methods might involve, but leaving implications that settled uneasily in Morgott's growing understanding of the world. The perfumer's interest in their nightmares proved particularly intense, his questions probing deeply into the nature of the visions and voices that plagued their sleep. He seemed especially fascinated by the way their dreams connected them to other times and places, as if the curse created some form of temporal or spiritual communication that conventional knowledge could not explain. Morgott found himself describing experiences that he had never spoken aloud before, putting words to sensations and visions that had seemed too alien for human language. These sessions with Rollo served as Morgott's first education in the broader world beyond his prison, though much of what he learned came in fragments and implications rather than direct statements. The perfumer spoke of his travels to other regions, of the different ways that various cultures addressed the problem of omen births, of the techniques being developed and refined to deal with the threat that such beings represented to the established order. Each conversation added new pieces to Morgott's understanding of his place in the world, though the picture that emerged was far from comforting. As his body continued to grow and his curse continued to evolve, Morgott found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his existence. The rage and resentment that had sustained him through the early years of his imprisonment were being challenged by something else, something that grew stronger with each passing season, despite the absence of any external reason for hope or faith. Perhaps it was the sheer majesty of the sounds that filtered down from above, the clear evidence of a civilization that had achieved wonders despite its flaws and cruelties. Perhaps it was the growing awareness of his own power, the strength that flowed through his cursed blood and suggested possibilities beyond mere survival. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that spoke to the divine nature of his parentage, despite the rejection that had defined his early life. Whatever the source, Morgott began to feel a growing sense of connection to the Erd Tree itself, that towering symbol of order and blessing that cast its golden light over everything except the depths where he languished. Even in his imprisonment, even denied the direct touch of its grace, he could sense the tree's presence like a vast heartbeat that synchronized with his own. The sounds of worship and ceremony that reached him spoke of something larger and more significant than the petty cruelties of his individual situation. In the deepest hours of night, When the castle above had settled into sleep and even the guards had relaxed their vigilance, Morgott would sometimes catch what he imagined might be the sound of the Erd tree itself, a low harmonic that seemed to resonate through stone and flesh alike. Whether this was reality or merely the product of his isolation-fevered imagination mattered less than the effect it had on his gradually evolving understanding of his place in the greater order of things. The tree represented perfection in ways that his cursed existence never could, but perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps his role was not to be perfect, but to serve perfection. Not to embody the divine order, but to protect it from those who might threaten its stability. This possibility began to shape his thinking in ways that would have seemed impossible during the early years of bitter resentment and despair. As these thoughts took root and grew within his consciousness, Morgott found himself listening to the sounds from above with different ears, hearing not just the evidence of his own exclusion, but the testimony of something worth preserving and protecting. The laughter of children spoke not just of joy he would never know, but of innocence that deserved to be maintained. The songs of celebration became hymns to an order that, whatever its flaws, had created something beautiful enough to inspire such devotion. The transformation was neither sudden nor complete, for the voices in his dreams continued to whisper of revenge, and the heat in his blood still burned with promises of destructive power. But alongside these familiar torments, a new voice began to make itself heard, one that spoke not of what he had been denied, but of what he might yet be able to offer in service to something greater than his own suffering. This internal evolution would eventually lead to changes that seemed impossible given the circumstances of his confinement. But for now, it remained a quiet revolution of the spirit, a gradual shift in perspective that prepared the ground for the extraordinary events that were yet to come. The sounds from above continued to mark the passage of time and the progress of a world that had forgotten his existence. But Morgott no longer listened to them with the ears of one excluded from grace. Instead, he began to hear them as the voice of something that might yet prove worthy of the ultimate sacrifice, even if that sacrifice came from the most unlikely and unwelcome of sources. In the darkness beneath Leyndell, where golden light had never shone and divine grace had never touched, a prince born cursed was slowly teaching himself the disciplines that would one day make him a king, though the crown he would claim would prove as heavy with sorrow as it was with responsibility. In the years that followed his emergence from the shunning grounds, as Morgott walked the surface world for the first time in decades and felt the weight of genuine sunlight upon his scarred flesh, something profound began to stir within the depths of his tormented consciousness. The transformation that would define the remainder of his existence was not born of sudden revelation, but grew slowly, like a flower taking root in soil that had been salted with bitterness and watered with tears of abandonment. The world above ground was both exactly as he had imagined it from the sounds that had filtered down to his underground prison, and utterly different from anything his isolated mind could have conceived. The sheer scale of Leyndell's magnificence overwhelmed senses that had known only cramped chambers and fetid air for so many years that he had lost count of their passage. Every breath of clean air felt like a luxury beyond measure. Every glimpse of architectural beauty, a reminder of what civilization could achieve when blessed by divine favor. Yet it was not the physical splendor of the capital that worked the greatest change upon Morgott's understanding of his place in the cosmic order. It was rather the gradual recognition of the intricate web of relationships and dependencies that held this great civilization together, the countless small acts of faith and cooperation that allowed such a complex society to function despite the flaws and imperfections that marked every individual who participated in its grand design. He observed the merchants in their daily transactions, noting how trust and mutual benefit created prosperity that lifted all participants above the level of mere survival. He watched craftsmen at their work, seeing how the pursuit of excellence in even the humblest trades contributed to the overall beauty and functionality of the world they were collectively building. He witnessed the ceremonies and rituals that bound the community together in shared purpose, recognizing in these observances something that transcended the immediate concerns of any individual participant. Most importantly, he began to understand the role that the Erd Tree itself played in making all of this possible. The Great Tree was not merely a symbol or even a source of magical power, though it was certainly both of these things. It was the organizing principle around which an entire civilization had arranged itself, the central reference point that gave meaning and direction to countless individual lives that might otherwise have dissolved into chaos and mutual destruction. The golden light that emanated from the tree's branches was more than illumination. It was guidance made visible, a constant reminder of the ideals and principles that elevated mortal existence above the level of mere survival. The grace that flowed from its presence was not simply magical energy, but the very force that made cooperation possible, that transformed collections of individuals into communities, and communities into something approaching the divine order that had been glimpsed in ages past. As Morgott walked the streets of Leyndell and observed the daily miracle of a functioning society, he began to understand that his own suffering, terrible though it had been, was not the result of arbitrary cruelty, but of the same principle that made all of this beauty and order possible. The exclusion of elements that might destabilize or corrupt the system was not a failing of the Golden Order, but one of its essential features. As necessary to its preservation as pruning was to the health of a garden, this recognition did not come without a tremendous internal struggle, for the voices that whispered in his dreams continued to offer alternatives that seemed far more appealing to the parts of his nature that craved recognition and revenge. The cursed blood that burned in his veins carried with it visions of a different kind of order, one built upon the acknowledgement of chaos and corruption as legitimate aspects of existence, rather than diseases to be contained or eliminated. In his moments of greatest pain and isolation, when the physical symptoms of his curse flared beyond his ability to endure them stoically, Morgott could feel the seductive pull of these alternative visions. How much easier it would be to embrace the power that flowed through his twisted form, to use his royal bloodline and supernatural strength to carve out a place for himself in the world through force, rather than continuing to accept exclusion and humiliation as the price of the greater good. The temptation was not merely personal but philosophical, for the curse that shaped his existence carried with it genuine insights into aspects of reality that the Golden Order preferred to ignore or suppress. The voices of the ancient spirits that crowded his consciousness spoke of ages when different principles had governed the world, when chaos and order had existed in balance rather than in constant conflict, when creatures like himself had been seen as necessary parts of the cosmic dance, rather than errors to be corrected. Yet, each time these alternative visions threatened to overwhelm his growing commitment to the established order, Morgott would force himself to remember what he had observed of the world that the Erd Tree's influence had made possible. Whatever the theoretical merits of other arrangements, whatever justice might exist in the complaints of the excluded and the cursed, the simple fact remained that the current system had produced something beautiful enough to justify its continuation. The children who played in Leyndell's courtyards, innocent of the violence and suffering that had been necessary to create their secure world, represented possibilities that might never again exist if the foundations of their civilization were shaken by well-intentioned reforms or righteous rebellions. The scholars who pursued knowledge in the castle's libraries, the artists who created beauty in its workshops, the ordinary citizens who lived their lives in peace and prosperity, All of these depended upon the stability that came from maintaining clear boundaries between what was acceptable and what was not. This understanding led Morgott to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible during his years of underground imprisonment, that his own exclusion from the benefits of the Golden Order was not a tragedy to be corrected, but a necessary sacrifice to be embraced. His cursed nature made him precisely the sort of destabilizing element that had to be contained for the system to function properly, and his recognition of this fact was the first step toward transforming his existence from a burden to be endured into a form of service to be perfected. The decision to seal away his cursed blood was born from this philosophical transformation, but the act itself required a form of spiritual discipline that pushed the boundaries of what mortal will could accomplish. The power that flowed through his Omen nature was not simply magical energy that could be redirected or contained. It was an integral part of his identity, woven into his consciousness at levels that transcended normal understanding of the relationship between mind and body. To recant this power, to deliberately turn away from abilities that represented his only real advantage in a world that had rejected him, required Morgott to reconstruct his entire sense of self around principles that offered him nothing in return for his sacrifice. He had to learn to find meaning in service to those who would never acknowledge his contributions, to take pride in protecting those who viewed his very existence as an abomination, to love what would never love him in return. The process was neither quick nor clean, for the cursed blood did not surrender its hold upon him easily. Each step toward the complete sealing of his Omen nature brought with it agonies that made his previous sufferings seem mild by comparison. The spirits that had tormented his dreams fought desperately against their banishment, filling his waking hours with visions of destruction and promises of revenge that would have broken a mind less thoroughly committed to its chosen path. The heat that had always burned in his veins became a conflagration that threatened to consume him entirely, while the physical symptoms of his curse intensified as if his body were rebelling against the constraints being placed upon its fundamental nature. There were moments when the pain became so overwhelming that Morgott wondered if he would survive the process of transformation he had chosen, and other moments when he wondered if survival was truly desirable, if it meant continuing to exist in such torment. Yet somehow, through a combination of will and faith that drew upon reserves of strength he had not known he possessed, Morgott managed to complete the sealing of his cursed blood without losing either his sanity or his life. The power remained within him, contained rather than destroyed, held in check by bonds that were spiritual as much as magical. The voices of the ancient spirits fell silent, their constant whispers replaced by a quietude that felt almost deafening after so many years of their presence. The completion of this self-imposed transformation marked Morgott's readiness to approach his mother with a proposition that would have seemed unthinkable during his years of imprisonment. He requested not freedom in the conventional sense, for he understood that such a thing was impossible given his nature, but rather the opportunity to serve the Golden Order in a capacity that would make use of his unique abilities while maintaining the necessary boundaries between himself and the society he wished to protect. Marika's response to this request revealed depths of pragmatic calculation that might have disappointed a son seeking maternal affection, but which Morgott found oddly comforting in their complete lack of sentimentality. She evaluated his proposal not as a mother considering her child's welfare, but as a ruler assessing the potential utility of an unusual resource. And her eventual agreement to his terms reflected her recognition of the advantages his service might provide, rather than any softening of her attitude toward his existence. The name Morgott represented more than a simple alias. It was a carefully constructed identity that allowed Morgott to function in the world above, while maintaining the psychological and social boundaries that his nature required. As Morgott, he could serve Marika's purposes without creating the complications that would inevitably arise if his true parentage became known. As Morgott, he could exercise power and authority while remaining clearly marked as something other than fully human, something that belonged to the margins of society rather than its center. The clothing he chose for this new identity reflected the complex relationship he had developed with his own nature and circumstances. The ragged furs and crude wrappings were not simply practical garments, but symbolic statements, constant reminders of his true station that prevented him from forgetting the humility that was essential to his new role. They were ugly and uncomfortable by design, ensuring that no moment of service or success would allow him to imagine that he had somehow transcended the fundamental realities of his cursed existence. The collar that encircled his neck was perhaps the most telling detail of his chosen appearance, its shape deliberately echoing the crucible symbol while serving as a visible mark of his subordinate status. It was neither a badge of office nor a decorative element, but something closer to the identifying mark placed upon livestock, a clear signal to all who saw him that whatever his abilities or accomplishments, he remained fundamentally property rather than person in the eyes of those he served. This self-imposed degradation was not born of healthy humility, but of something darker and more complex, a form of self-hatred that had been carefully cultivated through years of psychological conditioning and spiritual discipline. Morgott had learned to find a perverse form of pride in his willingness to embrace his own debasement, to view his acceptance of humiliation as evidence of his moral superiority to those who demanded recognition and respect for their service. The psychological mechanisms that made this possible were both sophisticated and deeply troubling, representing a form of adaptation that preserved his ability to function while potentially destroying his capacity for genuine self-regard. He had learned to reframe every indignity as a choice rather than an imposition, every rejection as confirmation of his virtue rather than evidence of injustice, every moment of suffering as an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to principles that transcended personal welfare. Whether this transformation represented genuine spiritual growth or elaborate psychological defense was a question that Morgott himself was no longer capable of answering objectively. The boundaries between voluntary sacrifice and compulsive self-destruction had become so blurred in his consciousness that he experienced his degradation as both burden and blessing, both the price of service and its reward. What remained clear was that this internal revolution had prepared him for forms of service that would have broken a mind less thoroughly committed to the principles of self-denial and institutional loyalty. The tasks that Marika would set for him in the years to come would require not only tremendous skill and courage, but also the ability to act against his own immediate interests and even his deeper moral intuitions when such action served the greater good, as defined by those he had chosen to it serve. The emergence of Morgott the Fell Omen as a figure of terror and legend was the inevitable result of this preparation, as Morgott found himself called upon to embody the very fears and prejudices that had shaped his own treatment while using them as tools to maintain the stability of the order that had created them. The irony was not lost on him, but neither did it trouble him as it once might have, for he had learned to find meaning in contradictions that might have driven others to despair or rebellion. In accepting his role as the Erd Tree's hidden guardian, Morgott completed a journey that had begun in the darkness of underground imprisonment and led through the painful wilderness of self-transformation to a destination that was neither the justice he might once have sought, nor the revenge he had sometimes contemplated, but something altogether more complex and perhaps more valuable. The peace that comes from perfect alignment between one's actions and one's deepest convictions, regardless of what those convictions might cost in terms of personal happiness or conventional moral approval. The man who walked the surface world as Morgott bore little resemblance to the bitter child who had once listened to the sounds of celebration filtering down through stone and earth. Yet the connection between these two figures was unbroken, a continuous thread of identity that had been refined and purified rather than severed. The curse remained, the pain continued, the exclusion was as complete as ever. But all of these elements had been transformed from sources of resentment into instruments of service, tools that enabled rather than hindered his capacity to protect what he had learned to love more than his own life. The emergence of Morgott the Fell Omen into the daylight world of Leyndell marked the beginning of a chapter in Morgott's existence that would define not only his own legacy, but the very nature of how power could be exercised from the shadows of an established order. No longer the abandoned child listening to celebrations from underground chambers, he had become something far more complex and dangerous. A weapon forged from suffering and tempered by absolute devotion to principles that most would consider antithetical to his very existence. The role that Marika carved out for her cursed son was both ingenious and deeply cynical, making use of the very prejudices and fears that had justified his imprisonment to create an instrument of policy that could operate beyond the normal constraints of law and custom. As Morgott could do things that would be impossible for any official representative of the royal family, could venture into places and situations where the presence of legitimate authority would create complications that might undermine the delicate balance of power that held the Golden Order together. The establishment of the Night Cavalry represented perhaps the most elegant solution to a problem that had plagued every successful civilization since the beginning of recorded history. What to do with heroes who had outlived their usefulness? During the great age of expansion and conquest, when Godfrey's campaigns had pushed the boundaries of the known world ever outward, and the Erdtree's influence had spread to encompass territories that previous generations could never have imagined, the emergence of exceptional individuals was not only welcome but necessary for the accomplishment of seemingly impossible tasks. Warriors whose skill transcended normal human limitations, leaders whose charisma could inspire common soldiers to achieve victories that should have been beyond their reach, visionaries whose understanding of strategy and tactics could turn desperate situations into triumphant conquests. These were the sort of people who had made the Golden Age possible, whose contributions had elevated Marika's reign from mere political success to something approaching divine mandate made manifest in the material world. Yet the very qualities that made such individuals invaluable during times of expansion and conflict made them potential threats during periods of consolidation and peace. The warrior whose courage had broken enemy lines on distant battlefields might find the constraints of civilian authority intolerable once the wars were won. The leader whose vision had guided followers through impossible campaigns might begin to question whether current policies truly served the greater good. The strategist whose understanding of power dynamics had proved decisive in military contexts might start to analyze the domestic arrangements that governed the kingdom itself. History provided abundant examples of what happened when such individuals were allowed to pursue their natural inclinations without guidance or constraint. Revolutionary movements, civil wars, dynastic struggles, and the collapse of institutions that had taken generations to build, all of these calamities could often be traced back to the actions of exceptional people who had concluded that their exceptional abilities gave them the right to reshape the world according to their personal vision of what constituted proper order. The solution that most civilizations adopted involved either co-opting potential troublemakers through offers of position and privilege within the existing system, or eliminating them before they could develop sufficient following to pose genuine threats. both approaches had serious limitations. Co-optation could never be entirely trusted, since it relied on the continued satisfaction of individuals whose very exceptionalism made them difficult to satisfy permanently, while elimination created its own problems by removing valuable human resources and potentially inspiring others to resistance through martyrdom. Morgott's Night Cavalry represented a third option, one that combined the practical benefits of elimination with a form of honor that could be presented as recognition rather than punishment. The heroes and champions who received visits from these spectral horsemen were not simply murdered in back alleys or assassinated through poison. They died in combat against foes whose skill was worthy of their own, in battles that could be remembered as glorious final chapters rather than ignominious endings. The ritual aspects of these encounters were carefully designed to reinforce, rather than undermine, the mythology of heroism that the Golden Order needed to maintain. The Night Cavalry rode funeral steeds whose very presence announced the sacred nature of their mission, while their weapons and armor bore the symbols and decorations that marked them as servants of legitimate authority rather than common murderers. The champions who faced them understood, even in their final moments, that they were dying not as victims of political expediency, but as participants in a cosmic drama that transcended their individual circumstances. The psychological preparation required for Morgott to carry out such duties would have broken a mind less thoroughly disciplined in the arts of self-abnegation and institutional loyalty. Each of the heroes marked for elimination had earned their reputations through genuine courage and skill, through sacrifices that had contributed to the prosperity and security that all citizens of the Golden Order enjoyed. They were not villains or criminals, but exemplars of virtues that the system officially celebrated, individuals whose only crime was possessing those virtues in quantities that made them dangerous to the stability of the very order they had helped create. To kill such people required Morgott to suppress not only his personal inclinations toward mercy and justice, but also his intellectual understanding of the contradictions inherent in his mission. He had to learn to see beyond the immediate human costs of his actions to the broader institutional benefits they produced, to weigh the lives of individual heroes against the peace and security of countless ordinary citizens who would never know that their safety had been purchased through the deaths of those who might have been their greatest protectors. The development of his skills as both warrior and assassin proceeded through years of careful training and practical experience that gradually transformed him from a powerful but undisciplined force into something approaching a perfect instrument of policy. The supernatural strength that his Omen heritage provided was channeled through techniques that had been perfected over generations of secret service to the crown, while his natural cunning was refined through exposure to the most sophisticated forms of political analysis and strategic thinking. The weapons he carried were not chosen for their beauty or symbolic value, but for their effectiveness in the specific types of combat that his missions required. Each piece of equipment had been tested and modified through practical use, adjusted to complement his unique physical capabilities while compensating for the limitations that his cursed nature imposed. The result was an arsenal that reflected both exceptional craftsmanship and ruthless pragmatism, tools that were as ugly and functional as the purposes they served. The psychological toll of this existence was managed through the same spiritual disciplines that had enabled him to seal away his cursed blood, techniques for compartmentalizing experience that allowed him to separate his actions from his emotions without losing touch with either entirely. He learned to find satisfaction in the perfect execution of difficult missions rather than in their moral justifications, to take pride in his skill and dedication rather than in the outcomes those qualities produced. The reputation that grew around Morgott the Fell Omen served multiple purposes within the complex ecosystem of fear and respect that maintained the Golden Order's stability. For potential troublemakers, the knowledge that exceptional ability might attract lethal attention provided a powerful incentive toward discretion and moderation. For ordinary citizens, the existence of such a figure reinforced the sense that their rulers possessed resources and capabilities that extended far beyond normal understanding, that challenges to established authority would meet responses that transcended conventional military or political action. Yet the psychological cost of maintaining this reputation required Morgott to embrace a form of isolation that went far beyond the physical separation he had known during his years of imprisonment. As Morgott, he could have no friends, no confidants, no relationships that were not shaped entirely by the requirements of his mission. Every interaction became a performance, every conversation a form of intelligence gathering or psychological manipulation, every moment of apparent spontaneity carefully calculated to serve purposes that could never be acknowledged openly. The filthy garments that he wore, as Morgott, served multiple functions within this complex performance of identity and purpose. On the most practical level, they reinforced his outsider status and marked him as something other than human in the eyes of those who encountered him. No one who saw this ragged, stinking figure would mistake him for a member of civilized society, let alone suspect his true parentage or the royal blood that flowed through his corrupted veins. More subtly, the deliberate degradation of his appearance served as a constant reminder to himself of his proper place within the hierarchy he served. The discomfort of wearing clothes that were never washed, never repaired, never replaced, except when they became so tattered that they could no longer serve their basic function of covering his body, provided a continuous backdrop of minor suffering that reinforced his commitment to self-denial and institutional loyalty. The collar that encircled his throat was perhaps the most psychologically complex element of his chosen appearance, simultaneously serving as badge of office, mark of ownership, and instrument of self-punishment. Its design deliberately echoed the crucible symbol, while transforming that ancient mark of divine blessing into something that spoke of subordination and containment. To those who understood such symbols, it announced that whatever power Morgott might possess was held in check by forces greater than himself, that he was weapon rather than wielder, tool rather than craftsman. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Morgott to find meaning and even satisfaction in such deliberate self-degradation represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his transformation. From abandoned child to perfect servant, he had learned to experience humiliation as a form of spiritual discipline, to find pride in his willingness to accept conditions that would drive others to rebellion or despair. The very completeness of his submission had become a source of secret superiority, a mark of virtue that elevated him above those who required recognition and respect to maintain their sense of self-worth. This inversion of normal psychological processes created a form of armor against the emotional wounds that his existence might otherwise have inflicted, but it came at the cost of genuine connection to his own emotional reality. Morgott could no longer distinguish clearly between choices he made freely and compulsions that had been imposed upon him through years of conditioning, between acts of service and acts of self-destruction, between love and the elaborate psychological defenses that allowed him to function in a world that had never shown him genuine affection. The effectiveness of Morgott's operations during this period was measured not only by the elimination of specific targets, but by the broader climate of caution and restraint that his activities created among the classes of people who might otherwise have been tempted to challenge established authority. Word of his interventions spread through networks of rumor and legend that amplified both his reputation and the psychological impact of his actions far beyond what direct experience alone could have achieved. Heroes and champions throughout the Golden Order began to moderate their ambitions and temper their public statements with an awareness that exceptional achievement might attract attention that no rational person would desire. The most successful among them learned to present their capabilities in ways that emphasized service to the crown rather than personal glory, to position themselves as instruments of royal policy rather than independent agents whose loyalty might be questioned. This climate of careful self-limitation served the purposes of stability and order, while gradually eroding the cultural foundations that had originally made heroism possible. The generation of warriors and leaders who had conquered the world for Marika had been shaped by values that celebrated individual achievement and rewarded those who were willing to take risks that ordinary prudence would condemn. The generation that succeeded them, living under the shadow of Morgott's reputation, learned different lessons about the relationship between ambition and survival. The irony that escaped no one who understood the full scope of these developments was that the very success of the Golden Order was gradually undermining the conditions that had made its success possible. By eliminating the sort of exceptional individuals who had built the empire, by discouraging the kind of independent thinking that had solved its most difficult problems, by replacing a culture of heroic achievement with one of cautious compliance, the system was trading long-term vitality for short-term stability in ways that might prove unsustainable if genuine challenges ever arose. Yet, from Morgott's perspective, these concerns were abstractions that paled in comparison to the immediate necessity of preserving what existed, rather than risking its destruction in pursuit of theoretical improvements. He had witnessed the beauty and prosperity that the Golden Order had created, had observed the countless individual lives that depended upon its continued stability, had come to understand the precious fragility of the civilization that his actions helped to protect. Whatever the long-term costs of the policies he implemented, they seemed justified by the alternative of watching everything collapse into the chaos and violence that had characterized the world before Marika's ascension. The loneliness of this existence was perhaps its most crushing burden, for it required Morgott to carry knowledge and responsibilities that could never be shared with another living soul. He alone understood the full scope of the threats that the Golden Order faced from within its own success. He alone bore the weight of decisions that determined who lived and who died based on calculations that reduced human lives to variables in equations of political stability. The moral complexity of these choices would have paralyzed anyone who allowed themselves to think too deeply about their implications. But Morgott had trained himself to focus on execution rather than evaluation, on perfect service rather than personal judgment. The rewards for this service were minimal by any conventional measure, consisting mainly of the satisfaction that came from missions accomplished and duties fulfilled without recognition or gratitude from those who benefited from his efforts. There were no ceremonies to mark his successes, no public acknowledgement of his contributions, no companionship or comfort to ease the burden of his isolation. He lived and worked in the shadows cast by the golden light that blessed everyone except himself, finding meaning in protection that could never be acknowledged and love that could never be reciprocated. Yet in those rare moments when he allowed himself to step back from the immediate demands of his duties and observe the larger patterns that his actions helped to maintain, Morgott could see evidence that his sacrifices had not been meaningless. The peace that settled over the lands between during this period was more than merely the absence of war. It was the positive presence of conditions that allowed human potential to flourish in ways that had been impossible during less stable times. The arts and sciences advanced, trade and commerce expanded. Ordinary people lived longer and more prosperous lives than their ancestors could have imagined. These achievements were not his alone, for they depended upon the contributions of countless individuals whose talents and efforts he had helped to protect and channel. But they were achievements that might never have been possible without the dark work that he performed in service of principles that transcended his personal welfare or conventional notions of justice. In choosing to become Morgott the Fell Omen, Morgott had found a way to transform his cursed existence into an instrument of preservation and protection, to make his suffering serve purposes that elevated it above mere victimization. The man who rode with the night cavalry through the darkness of the lands between was no longer the bitter child who had once listened to celebrations from underground chambers, but neither had he become someone entirely different. The connection between these two figures was unbroken, a continuous thread of identity that had been refined and purified through suffering into something that could serve purposes greater than personal happiness or conventional success. The curse remained, the pain continued, the exclusion was as complete as ever, but all of these elements had been transformed from obstacles into advantages, from burdens into tools that enabled rather than hindered his capacity to protect what he had learned to value more than his own life. The night that would forever change the trajectory of Morgott's existence began like countless others during the golden age of Elden, with the measured patrol routes of the night cavalry carrying their silent riders through the darkness that surrounded the capital, like a protective shroud. For years beyond easy counting, these spectral guardians had maintained their vigil with mechanical precision, their presence serving as both deterrent and promise to any who might consider challenging the established order through exceptional achievement or unauthorized ambition. Morgott himself rode at the head of this nocturnal procession, his form hunched and terrible upon a steed whose breath misted with the cold touch of death itself. The funeral horses that bore the night cavalry were creatures that existed at the intersection of life and shadow, their hooves striking sparks from cobblestones that seemed to burn with otherworldly fire before fading into memory. These were not mortal beasts, but embodiments of inevitability itself, manifestations of the principle that all earthly glory must eventually submit to forces greater than individual will or collective ambition. The routes they followed had been established through years of careful observation and strategic analysis, designed to maximize their psychological impact while ensuring that no corner of the realm remained unwatched for extended periods. From the great highways that connected Elden to distant provinces, through the smaller roads that served merchant caravans and diplomatic missions, to the hidden paths known only to smugglers and others who preferred to conduct their business away from official scrutiny, the night cavalry maintained a presence that reminded all travelers of the watchful eyes that observed their movements. On this particular evening, as autumn mists rose from the rivers that watered the capital's fertile surroundings, and the first hints of winter's approach touched the air with promises of dormancy and reflection, Morgott's patrol had proceeded without incident through the established checkpoints that marked their customary circuit. The kingdom's roads were quiet, bearing only the usual traffic of late-season merchants, hurrying to complete their business before weather made travel more difficult, and pilgrims making their way toward the various shrines and temples that dotted the landscape like seeds of devotion scattered by some divine gardener. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, forces were already in motion that would transform this night of routine vigilance into one of catastrophic failure and personal reckoning. In chambers far below the castle where Morgott had once been imprisoned, in meeting places hidden from the eyes of conventional surveillance, in the spaces between official reality and the shadowy world of professional violence, preparations had been completed for an operation that would strike at the very heart of the Golden Order's sense of invulnerability. The Black Knife assassins had spent months, perhaps years, preparing for this moment with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that separated successful conspiracies from mere wishes clothed in desperate hope. These were not common murderers driven by personal grievance or political fanaticism, but artists of death whose skills had been honed through training and experience that bordered on the supernatural. Their very existence represented a level of organized opposition to Marika's rule that should have been impossible given the effectiveness of the surveillance and elimination systems that Morgott had spent so much effort perfecting. The magic that concealed them from detection was unlike anything that the Golden Order's scholars and investigators had previously encountered, a form of veiling that operated on principles that seemed to exist outside the established understanding of how supernatural forces could be channeled and controlled. Their cloaks did not simply render them invisible to normal sight, but somehow removed them from the broader web of awareness that connected all things within the Erd Tree's influence, creating pockets of absence that neither magical senses nor trained intuition could penetrate. The weapons they carried had been crafted specifically for this mission, blades that could cut through more than flesh and bone to strike at the spiritual foundations of life itself. The death they dealt was not the simple cessation of biological function, but something far more profound and permanent, a severing of connections that bound soul to body in ways that transcended normal understanding of mortality. These were instruments designed to kill gods and demigods, to inflict wounds that could not be healed through conventional magic or divine intervention. The target they had chosen represented both the most valuable and most heavily defended prize within their reach. For Prince Godwyn, the Golden was not merely another member of the royal family, but the living embodiment of everything that the Golden Order claimed to represent. His beauty was so perfect that it seemed to have been crafted by divine hands rather than shaped by natural processes, while his courage and nobility in battle had earned him a reputation that extended far beyond the borders of his mother's realm. More importantly, Godwyn's death would accomplish something that no amount of conventional warfare or political maneuvering could achieve. It would prove that the Golden Order's claims of divine protection and eternal blessing were hollow pretenses that could be shattered by those with sufficient skill and determination. The psychological impact of such a demonstration would reverberate through every level of society, from the highest councils of state to the humblest villages where common folk had learned to take comfort in the apparent invincibility of their divinely blessed rulers. The night of the assassination unfolded with the terrible precision of a clockwork mechanism whose gears had been crafted from nightmares and oiled with the blood of innocents. While Morgott and his cavalry pursued their established routes through the outer reaches of the capital's defensive perimeter, the Black Knife assassins moved through the castle itself like shadows given deadly purpose, their veiled forms passing through security measures that should have detected any unauthorized presence with ease. The guards who should have sounded alarms or raised challenges never perceived the threat that moved among them, their training and experience rendered useless by magic that operated according to principles they had no framework for understanding. Doors that should have remained locked opened silently at the assassin's touch, while the various mechanical and supernatural defenses that protected the royal quarters failed to respond to intrusions that existed somehow outside their sphere of detection. Godwyn himself slept the peaceful sleep of one who had never known real danger, his chambers arranged with the casual elegance that marked him as someone born to luxury and comfort, but shaped by duty into something worthy of the privileges he enjoyed. The walls were decorated with trophies from his various military campaigns, weapons and armor that had been claimed from defeated enemies and transformed into monuments to victories that had expanded his mother's dominion across previously unconquered territories. Books and scrolls covered tables and shelves, evidence of intellectual pursuits that complemented his martial achievements and demonstrated the breadth of education that befitted one destined for eventual rule. Maps marked with the routes of planned expeditions spoke of ambitions that extended beyond mere conquest toward genuine exploration and understanding of the world's hidden corners. while correspondence from allies and admirers throughout the known world testified to the respect and affection his character had earned from those who knew him personally. The attack itself unfolded with a swiftness that made resistance impossible, even if the prince had been awake and armed when it commenced. The black knife that pierced his flesh carried with it not merely physical death, but something far more comprehensive and terrible: a dissolution of the bonds that connected his divine soul to its mortal housing. The scream that should have erupted from his lips as consciousness returned in his final moments emerged instead as barely a whisper, his voice strangled by the supernatural forces that were already beginning their work of separation and severing. The assassins withdrew as silently as they had arrived, their mission accomplished with the kind of professional efficiency that left no traces beyond the corpse they had created, and the profound disturbance their presence had introduced into the fabric of reality itself. Yet even their supernatural skills could not entirely erase the ripples that their actions had created, for the death of a demigod was an event of such cosmic significance that it resonated through dimensions that normal consciousness could not perceive, but that trained senses might detect if they knew what to seek. It was these ripples, these disturbances in the underlying harmony that the Erdtree's presence normally maintained, that finally alerted Morgott to the catastrophe that had unfolded while he pursued his routine patrol through territories that now seemed mockingly peaceful in their mundane tranquility. The sensation struck him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden awareness that something fundamental had been torn from the world he had dedicated his existence to protecting. The ride back toward the castle became a desperate race against time and growing certainty, his funeral steed's hooves striking sparks from stones that seemed to burn with accusatory fire as they carried him toward a reckoning he already knew he would find unbearable. The other members of his cavalry followed in his wake, their own supernatural senses gradually awakening to the magnitude of what had occurred, though none could yet comprehend the full scope of the disaster that awaited their discovery. The scene that greeted them in Godwin's chambers was one that would haunt Morgott's memory for the remainder of his existence, a tableau of violation and loss that struck at the very foundations of everything he had believed about his ability to serve and protect those under his care. The prince's body lay where it had fallen, beautiful still, but touched by a corruption that spoke of wounds that extended far beyond the physical realm, into territories where healing became impossible, and death took on meanings that transcended normal understanding. The spiritual damage was visible to eyes trained in the recognition of supernatural phenomena, manifesting as a darkness that seemed to emanate from the corpse itself and spread through the surrounding space, like an infection that consumed light and warmth and hope with equal efficiency. This was not merely the absence of life, but the presence of something actively opposed to life, a force that transformed what it touched from potential into negation, from possibility into the kind of emptiness that preceded creation itself. The black knife that had accomplished this atrocity lay beside its victim, its blade still glowing with the otherworldly energies that had made such devastation possible. The weapon itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent satisfaction, as if it possessed some form of consciousness that took pleasure in the scope of destruction it had been able to accomplish. To touch such an instrument would be to risk contamination by the same forces it channeled, yet its presence served as undeniable evidence of the sophistication and power that their enemies had managed to assemble while remaining completely hidden from the surveillance systems that should have detected any such threat. The realization that the assassins might still be within reach sent Morgott and his cavalry into immediate pursuit, their supernatural abilities finally attuned to the specific form of concealment that their quarry employed. The chase that followed carried them through corridors and chambers that had never known violence, past portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to witness their failure with expressions of disappointment and reproach, through gardens and courtyards that would forever bear the memory of this night's catastrophe. The assassins proved as skilled in escape as they had been in infiltration, their movements coordinated with the precision that spoke of extensive planning and rehearsal for exactly this contingency. Yet the supernatural speed and determination of their pursuers gradually closed the distance between hunter and prey, until the inevitable confrontation occurred in one of the castle's outer bailey areas, where the architecture provided both obstacles and opportunities for those skilled in the arts of three-dimensional combat. The battle that ensued was unlike anything that the night cavalry had previously experienced. A clash between two different philosophies of warfare that operated according to incompatible principles and assumptions. The assassins fought with the fluid grace of water flowing around obstacles, their movements impossible to predict because they seemed to exist partially outside the normal constraints of physics and causality. Their attacks came from directions that should have been impossible, their defenses held against blows that should have been unavoidable. Their very presence on the battlefield seemed to warp space and time in ways that made conventional tactics useless. Yet for all their supernatural abilities, the Black Knife assassins had not anticipated the sheer fury and desperation that would drive their pursuers once the full scope of their crime became apparent. Morgott's cavalry fought not merely as soldiers following orders, but as guardians who had failed in their most sacred duty, whose very existence had been revealed as inadequate to the responsibilities they had assumed. The shame and rage that powered their assault transcended normal human emotion to become something that partook of divine wrath itself, a force that proved capable of matching and eventually overwhelming even supernatural opposition. The leader of the assassins, the figure who would later be identified as Alecto herself, fought with a skill that bordered on the impossible, her twin blades weaving patterns of death through the air that seemed to exist independently of her physical movements. Each strike carried with it not merely the potential for bodily harm, but the promise of the same spiritual severing that had claimed Prince Godwyn, weapons that could cut through the bonds connecting soul to flesh with the casual efficiency of a farmer's scythe harvesting grain. Yet, even her legendary abilities proved insufficient against the combined assault of opponents who had been pushed beyond the normal limits of mortal capability by the extremity of their situation. The battle's turning point came when Tisha, Alecto's daughter, and perhaps the most gifted of all the Black Knife assassins, threw herself between her mother and a blow that would have ended the engagement decisively. The young woman's sacrifice bought precious moments for Alecto's escape, but at a cost that transformed victory into something that felt more like mutual defeat. The capture of Alecto herself required the combined efforts of the entire Night Cavalry, their supernatural strength, barely sufficient to contain a prisoner whose abilities seemed to exist outside the normal constraints that governed even the most exceptional mortal capabilities. The bonds they placed upon her were woven from the same magical principles that had once contained Morgott himself in the depths beneath Lanedell, golden fetters that drew their power directly from the Erd Tree's influence, and could not be broken through any application of physical force or conventional magic. The Everjail that became Alecto's prison was constructed with a haste that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, the magical architecture taking shape through the application of techniques and resources that had been held in reserve for the most extreme emergencies. The result was a containment system that existed partially outside normal space and time, a dimensional pocket where the assassin leader could be held indefinitely without risk of escape or rescue by her remaining followers. Yet even these victories felt hollow in the face of the magnitude of what had been lost. For the death of Prince Godwyn represented a failure of protection that could not be undone through any amount of successful retaliation. The Golden Order's claim to divine blessing and eternal security had been shattered as thoroughly as if the Erd Tree itself had been struck by lightning, revealing vulnerabilities that enemies throughout the known world would certainly attempt to exploit once word of the assassination spread beyond the capital's borders. The creation of the Sentry's Torch represented Morgott's attempt to transform his failure into future success, to develop tools and techniques that would prevent similar catastrophes from occurring again. The magical principles embedded in the device were derived from careful analysis of the concealment methods that the Black Knife assassins had employed, countermeasures designed to reveal the specific form of veiling that had proved so devastatingly effective. The torch's flame burned with a light that existed on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, its illumination capable of revealing hidden truths that normal vision could not perceive. When carried by those trained in its proper use, the device could expose assassins who relied on magical concealment, could detect the presence of otherworldly influences that might otherwise remain unnoticed, could serve as an early warning system against threats that operated according to principles outside conventional understanding. Yet the distribution of these torches to other guardians and protectors throughout the realm carried with it an implicit acknowledgement of the Night Cavalry's failure, a public admission that the security systems they had spent years perfecting were inadequate to the challenges that the Golden Order now faced. Each torch that was placed in other hands represented not only a tool for future defense, but also a monument to the limitations that had allowed Prince Godwyn's assassination to succeed despite all their vigilance and preparation. The personal weight of this failure pressed down upon Morgott with a force that threatened to crush the spiritual disciplines that had enabled him to function as Morgott for so many years. The prince whose death had occurred under his protection had not been merely another member of the royal family, but the living symbol of everything that the Golden Order claimed to represent, the heir whose eventual rule would have continued the golden age that Marika's reign had established. More importantly, Godwyn had been his brother, the sibling whose beauty and perfection had served as a constant reminder of what Morgott himself might have been if not for the curse that had shaped his existence from the moment of birth. The relationship between them had been distant by necessity, limited to the brief encounters that occurred when Morgott's duties brought him into the presence of the royal court. But those moments had been precious beyond measure to one who had known so little of genuine family connection. In those rare conversations, Godwyn had treated Morgott with a courtesy and respect that transcended the obvious differences in their status and appearance, never showing the disgust or fear that most court officials displayed when forced to acknowledge the fell Omen's presence. Whether this kindness had been born of genuine affection, political calculation, or simple good manners mattered less than the fact that it had provided Morgott with one of the few relationships in his existence that contained elements of warmth and mutual recognition. The loss of that connection, combined with the professional failure that had made it possible, created a crisis of faith that threatened to unravel the careful psychological construction that had enabled Morgott to find meaning and purpose in his service to an order that had never shown him genuine acceptance. The voices that he had learned to silence through spiritual discipline began to whisper, once again, of alternative possibilities, of paths that might lead away from self-denial toward forms of fulfillment that did not require the constant sacrifice of personal happiness for institutional loyalty. Yet even in this moment of maximum spiritual crisis, even as the foundations of his carefully constructed worldview cracked and shifted under the weight of catastrophic failure, Morgott found himself unable to abandon the principles that had given shape and meaning to his adult existence. The death of Prince Godwyn was indeed a tragedy that called into question the effectiveness of the systems he had helped to maintain, but it did not invalidate the underlying beauty and value of the civilization that those systems were designed to protect. The shockwaves that Prince Godwin's assassination sent through the Golden Order would soon manifest in ways that Morgott could not yet imagine, as Queen Marika's grief and rage transformed her from the stable center around which the entire system revolved into a force of change so radical that it would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The shattering of the Elden Ring, when it came, would represent not merely a political crisis, but a cosmic catastrophe that would test every assumption about the nature of order and chaos, divine blessing and mortal responsibility. But in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, as Morgott knelt beside his brother's corrupted corpse and struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had been lost, the future remained shrouded in uncertainties that would soon resolve themselves into challenges more severe than any that the Golden Order had previously faced. The age of stability and prosperity was ending, though few yet understood the full implications of what was beginning to take its place. And the skills that had made Morgott an effective guardian during times of peace would soon be tested against enemies and obstacles that would demand forms of service more extreme than any he had previously imagined possible. The moment when Queen Marika raised her golden hammer and brought it crashing down upon the Elden Ring marked not merely the end of an age, but the beginning of a catastrophe that would reshape the very foundations of reality itself. The sound that echoed through the dimensions as the ring shattered was unlike anything that mortal ears had ever been forced to endure, a discordant symphony of breaking that seemed to emanate from the heart of creation itself and spread outward in waves that left nothing unchanged in their wake. For Morgott, who had dedicated his entire existence to the preservation and protection of the Golden Order, the ring's destruction represented a betrayal so profound that it challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of divine authority and the proper relationship between ruler and ruled. The mother who had cast him into darkness as a child, who had later granted him the opportunity to serve her purposes while remaining forever outside the circle of her genuine affection, had now revealed herself capable of destroying the very system that had given meaning and structure to his carefully constructed life of sacrifice and devotion. Yet, even as the cosmic shockwaves of Marika's desperate act rippled through the fabric of existence itself, transforming fundamental principles of reality into variables that could be manipulated by those with sufficient power and will, Morgott found himself unable to condemn the woman whose grief had driven her to such extremes. The death of Prince Godwin had been more than the loss of a beloved son. It had been proof that the Golden Order's claims of eternal blessing and divine protection were hollow pretenses that could be shattered by enemies with sufficient skill and determination. The great runes that scattered across the lands between like fragments of a broken mirror carried within them not merely magical power, but the potential for entirely new forms of order and authority to emerge from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Each shard contained enough concentrated divine essence to transform its bearer into something approaching godhood, enough raw creative force to reshape reality according to whatever vision might guide its wielder's ambitions and desires. The message that accompanied Marika's gift to her surviving children carried within it both invitation and threat, promising elevation to divine status for those who proved themselves worthy while threatening abandonment and sacrifice for those who failed to seize the opportunities that chaos had created. The words themselves were crafted with the cruel precision that had always characterized Marika's approach to matters of statecraft, offering hope and advancement while making clear that these benefits would come only to those willing to pay whatever price success might demand. For most of Morgott's siblings, the temptation proved irresistible in ways that revealed the shallowness of their previous devotion to the established order. The power contained within the great runes offered possibilities that had been unimaginable during the long centuries of stable hierarchy and clearly defined roles, opportunities to transcend the limitations that birth and circumstance had imposed upon their ambitions and desires. Radahn, whose strength in battle had already earned him legendary status among the armies of the Golden Order, saw in his rune the possibility of becoming something more than merely the greatest warrior of his generation. The power to hold back the very stars themselves, to command celestial forces that had previously been beyond mortal influence, represented an elevation of his already impressive capabilities to levels that bordered on the cosmic. Rykard, whose intellectual brilliance had made him invaluable as an advisor and administrator, recognized in his rune the potential to remake the fundamental structures of society according to principles that his studies had convinced him were superior to those that currently held sway. The vision of a new order built upon different foundations, one that might prove more stable and just than what had come before, proved too compelling to resist despite the obvious risks that such revolutionary changes would entail. Rani, whose mastery of sorcery had already set her apart from her more conventionally minded siblings, understood that her rune offered pathways to forms of knowledge and power that had been sealed away since the earliest days of creation. The opportunity to transcend not merely political limitations, but the basic constraints of mortal existence itself, represented the fulfillment of research and experimentation that had occupied her thoughts for decades. Even Millennia, whose devotion to her twin brother Michaela had seemed absolute and unshakable, found herself tempted by possibilities that might enable her to cure the scarlet rot that had plagued her existence since childhood and threatened to consume everything she touched with its corrupting influence. The promise of transformation, of escape from the biological prison that had shaped her identity in ways both visible and invisible, proved stronger than her previous commitment to maintaining the stability of the established order. Most shocking of all was the transformation of Morgott's own twin, who had shared the depths of the shunning grounds and experienced firsthand the cruelties that the Golden Order could inflict upon those it deemed unworthy of grace. Rather than using his newfound power to reform the system that had oppressed them both, Morg chose to abandon it entirely in favor of creating something altogether different and potentially more terrible. The dynasty of blood that Morg envisioned represented a complete rejection of the principles that had governed the Golden Order, replacing its emphasis on light and stability with a celebration of darkness and change that drew its inspiration from sources that predated civilization itself. The kidnapping of Michaela, the most innocent and promising of all the demigods, served not merely as a strategic move, but as a symbolic statement about the relationship between old authority and new ambition. Yet Morgott, despite having more reason than any of his siblings to embrace alternatives to the system that had rejected him, found himself unable to see the ring's shattering as anything other than a catastrophe that needed to be contained and ultimately reversed. The power that his great rune offered, the possibility of claiming authority that had been denied him throughout his existence, held no appeal compared to the urgent necessity of preserving what remained of the civilization that had created such beauty and prosperity during its golden age. The decision to resist the temptation of personal advancement in favor of protecting the institutions that had never shown him genuine acceptance required Morgott to call upon reserves of spiritual discipline that he had been building throughout his years of service as Morgott the Fell Omen. The ability to distinguish between what he wanted for himself and what the greater good required had become so deeply ingrained in his character that the choice felt inevitable rather than heroic, a natural expression of values that had been refined through countless smaller sacrifices and acts of self-denial. The assumption of the crown and the public identity of King Morgott represented perhaps the greatest irony in the entire tragic history of the Golden Order, as the child who had been hidden away in shame became the adult who stepped forward to preserve what his more legitimate siblings had chosen to abandon or destroy. The very qualities that had made him unsuitable for recognition during times of prosperity and stability proved to be exactly what the crisis demanded. Absolute devotion to principles that transcended personal interest, willingness to accept responsibility without expectation of reward, and the kind of strategic thinking that could function effectively under conditions of extreme uncertainty and danger. The veiled monarch who emerged from the shadows to claim authority over Lendel was simultaneously the most qualified and least legitimate ruler in the kingdom's history, a figure whose deep understanding of the system's strengths and weaknesses came from having been excluded from its benefits while remaining committed to its preservation. The illusions and misdirections that allowed him to rule without revealing his true nature represented not merely practical necessities, but artistic expressions of the complex relationship between appearance and reality that had defined his entire existence. The grace that finally touched Morgott upon his assumption of royal authority came not as recognition of his worthiness, but as acknowledgement of his utility, the greater will's pragmatic acceptance of an imperfect solution to an unprecedented crisis. The divine blessing that had been withheld throughout his years of faithful service was granted only when circumstances made his elevation unavoidable, a timing that revealed the essentially transactional nature of the relationship between mortal devotion and cosmic favor. The war that followed represented the collision between Morgott's vision of restored order and his siblings' various dreams of revolutionary transformation, a conflict that would determine not merely who held political power, but what fundamental principles would govern reality itself in the ages to come. The battles fought during this period were unlike any that had preceded them, clashes between forces that wielded fragments of divine authority in pursuit of goals that were incompatible with each other's continued existence. The siege of Lendel became a test of everything that Morgott had learned during his years of service in the shadows, requiring him to coordinate defenses against enemies who possessed powers that conventional military wisdom had no framework for understanding. The walls that protected the capital were more than mere stone and mortar. They were physical manifestations of the principle of order itself, barriers that drew their strength from the same cosmic forces that had originally established the Golden Age. Radon's assault represented perhaps the greatest single threat that the capital faced during this period, as the Star Scourge brought with him not merely armies of exceptional skill and determination, but the power to manipulate celestial forces in ways that could reshape the battlefield itself. The sight of stars held motionless in their courses by the general's will served as a constant reminder of the scope of power that the great runes had made available to those willing to claim them. The defense against such overwhelming force required Morgott to employ strategies that went far beyond conventional military tactics, drawing upon illusions and misdirections that transformed the very geography surrounding the capital into a weapon of war. The false visions and phantom armies that he projected created confusion and uncertainty among attacking forces while conserving the limited resources that were actually available for the city's protection. The psychological warfare that Morgott conducted during these battles represented the culmination of skills that had been developing throughout his career as the Fell Omen, techniques for inspiring fear and doubt that proved as effective against demigod armies as they had been against individual heroes and champions. The reputation he had built through years of eliminating potential threats now served as a force multiplier that made each of his actual capabilities seem more dangerous and unpredictable than mere observation would suggest. Yet perhaps the most morally complex aspect of Morgott's defense of the capital was his decision to employ omens as disposable weapons in the conflict, using his own cursed kin as expendable resources in battles that their untrained strength and supernatural resilience made them uniquely suited to survive. The cleavers he provided for these reluctant soldiers were designed not merely to take advantage of their physical capabilities, but to ensure that they could not become threats to the established order once the immediate crisis had passed. The cursed weapons that broke after extended use represented a form of insurance against the possibility that Omen warriors might retain their arms and turn them against the very system that had oppressed them throughout their existence. The blisters and wounds that the handleless blades inflicted upon those who wielded them served as constant reminders of their expendable status, while providing practical motivation to end battles as quickly as possible. The moral weight of these decisions pressed upon Morgott with a force that threatened to crush the spiritual disciplines that had enabled him to function effectively throughout his adult life. The knowledge that he was treating others exactly as he himself had been treated, using the suffering of the innocent to preserve institutions that would never acknowledge their sacrifices, created internal tensions that required constant effort to manage and contain. Yet the alternatives to such harsh pragmatism seemed even more morally problematic when considered from the perspective of someone responsible for protecting millions of innocent civilians who had played no role in creating the crisis, but would bear its costs if the capital's defenses failed. The children who played in Lanedel's courtyards, the scholars who pursued knowledge in its libraries, the merchants and craftsmen whose work sustained its prosperity, all of these depended upon decisions that reduced individual lives to variables in equations of collective survival. The recruitment of banished knights and other outcasts represented a different form of moral complexity, as Morgott found himself offering redemption and purpose to individuals whose crimes or failures had earned them exile from respectable society. The opportunity to transform disgrace into honor through service to the crown proved attractive to many who had given up hope of ever recovering their lost status and respect. Engval, whose rejection of Margit's original summons had marked him as someone with principles that transcended mere obedience to authority, eventually chose to answer the call when the stakes became clear and the need became desperate. His service as guardian of a masterless castle represented exactly the sort of autonomous responsibility that the crisis demanded. Protection offered without hope of recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Oleg, whose transformation from banished disgrace to honored defender illustrated the possibilities for redemption that the war created, earned his eventual Erdtree burial through actions that proved his worth, despite the failures that had originally marked him as unfit for service. The 100 traitors who fell to his blade represented not merely military victories but moral vindication for someone who had been given a second chance to prove his loyalty and effectiveness. The siege of Volcano Manor represented Morgott's most aggressive action against the forces of revolutionary change, a sustained campaign designed to demonstrate that abandonment of the Golden Order would be met with consequences severe enough to discourage others from following Rykard's example. The suffering inflicted upon the manor's defenders served not merely as punishment for their disloyalty, but as a warning to any who might be tempted to embrace alternatives to established authority. The effectiveness of these various strategies in maintaining the capital's security came at costs that extended far beyond the immediate military casualties and resource expenditures that such operations required. The transformation of Lanedel from a symbol of prosperity and cultural achievement into a fortress under siege represented a fundamental change in the character of the civilization that Morgott was fighting to preserve. The citizens who had once walked the capital streets with the confidence that came from living under divine protection now moved through their daily routines with the constant awareness that war raged just beyond their walls and that their continued safety depended upon the outcome of battles they could not see, but whose effects shaped every aspect of their existence. The culture of celebration and achievement that had characterized the Golden Age gradually gave way to one of endurance and defensive determination. The unbreached walls that stood as testament to Morgott's strategic brilliance and tactical skill also served as barriers that separated the capital from the broader world it had once led and influenced, transforming Leyndell from the beating heart of a great civilization into an isolated stronghold whose survival had become an end in itself rather than a means to greater purposes. Yet, even as the immediate goals of defense and preservation were achieved through methods that would have been unthinkable during more peaceful times, Morgott found himself unable to complete the ultimate task that his position as king demanded. The Erdtree itself remained sealed by thorns that his authority could not penetrate, its interior spaces barred to someone whose fundamental nature marked him as unworthy of entry, despite his perfect record of service and devotion. The irony of being granted royal authority while remaining forever excluded from the source of that authority's legitimacy represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of Morgott's entire existence, a reminder that even perfect service could not overcome the essential incompatibility between his cursed nature and the divine order he had chosen to serve. The thorn wall that blocked his access to the tree served as a daily reminder of limitations that no amount of sacrifice or achievement could transcend. The loneliness of ruling through illusion while knowing that his ultimate goal remained forever beyond reach created strains that even Morgott's carefully developed spiritual disciplines struggled to contain. The voices that he had learned to silence began to whisper once again of alternatives and possibilities, of paths that might lead away from endless service toward forms of fulfillment that did not require the constant denial of his own nature and needs. Yet even in moments of deepest doubt and spiritual crisis, even when the futility of his chosen path seemed most obvious and the alternatives most attractive, Morgott found himself unable to abandon the principles that had given shape and meaning to his adult existence. The beauty and value of what he protected remained real, regardless of his personal exclusion from its benefits, and the alternative visions offered by his siblings continued to seem less compelling than the preservation of what already existed. The king, who ruled from shadows while his subjects celebrated victories they attributed to divine favor rather than mortal strategy, had become something unprecedented in the history of the lands between. A figure whose perfect devotion to principles that offered him nothing in return had transformed him into both the most effective and most tragic ruler his kingdom had ever known. The appearance of the Tarnished in the lands between represented more than merely the arrival of another ambitious soul, seeking power and glory among the ruins of a shattered civilization. To Morgott, whose reign as the veiled monarch had been defined by the constant necessity of eliminating threats before they could grow strong enough to challenge the delicate balance that held his kingdom together, these returning exiles carried within their very existence the seeds of everything he had spent decades fighting to prevent. The guidance of grace that led the Tarnished along paths toward greater strength and influence was the same divine favor that had been withheld from Morgott throughout his years of perfect service, a bitter irony that spoke to the essentially pragmatic nature of the greater will's relationship with mortal instruments. Those who had been cast out for their failures and inadequacies were now being summoned back and blessed with advantages that had never been offered to one whose loyalty had never wavered despite every provocation and abandonment. Yet the returning Tarnished represented more than simply another category of potential usurpers to be eliminated through the established mechanisms of the Night Cavalry and their spectral enforcement. These were individuals who had been shaped by exile and hardship into something fundamentally different from the heroes and champions that Morgott had spent so many years culling. Warriors whose understanding of power and responsibility had been forged in the crucible of genuine loss, rather than tempered through the comfortable certainties of inherited privilege. The first Tarnished to draw Morgott's serious attention was one whose approach to the acquisition of great runes suggested a level of systematic thinking and long-term planning that set them apart from the more impulsive, glory seekers who typically sought to challenge the established order. Rather than attempting a direct assault upon Leyndell's defenses or engaging in the sort of dramatic gestures that characterized most rebellious movements, this particular exile had chosen to begin their campaign in the distant reaches of Limgrave, gathering strength and resources through methodical exploration of territories that more conventional conquerors might dismiss as irrelevant to their greater ambitions. The decision to manifest as Morgott at Stormveil Castle represented both a test of this Tarnished's capabilities and an expression of contempt for the predictable patterns that seemed to govern their behavior. Like so many before them, they had allowed themselves to be guided by the promise of easy victory over Godric the Grafted, a demigod whose pathetic attempts at self-improvement through bodily modification had rendered him more grotesque than genuinely threatening, despite his possession of a great rune. The ancient castle that Godric had claimed as his fortress represented everything that was wrong with the current state of the lands between, a once magnificent structure that had been corrupted and defaced by its current occupants' desperate attempts to compensate for his fundamental inadequacies through cosmetic changes that addressed none of the underlying problems they were meant to solve. The grafting of additional limbs and organs onto his increasingly monstrous form served as a perfect metaphor for the sort of shallow thinking that characterized most revolutionary movements, attempts to achieve transformation through accumulation rather than genuine reform. The Tarnished who approached Stormveil's gates moved with a confidence that suggested either exceptional skill or dangerous delusion. Their equipment and manner, speaking of someone who had learned to survive through careful observation and strategic thinking, rather than through the sort of reckless courage that typically marked those who sought glory through combat with legendary foes. This measured approach to obvious danger suggested a mind capable of learning from experience, a quality that made them potentially far more threatening than the usual collection of glory seekers and would-be heroes. The illusion that Morgott projected to block their path was crafted with all the skill and psychological insight that years of experience in such matters had provided, designed not merely to present a physical obstacle, but to test the deeper qualities of character and commitment that would determine whether this particular Tarnished deserved serious attention. The appearance he assumed was calculated to inspire exactly the right mixture of fear and fascination, impressive enough to command respect but not so overwhelming as to discourage a worthy opponent from accepting the challenge. The words he chose for this first encounter were weighted with multiple layers of meaning, each phrase designed to probe different aspects of the Tarnished psychology, while simultaneously establishing the terms under which any future interactions would occur. The mockery directed at their obvious ignorance served not merely as insult but as invitation, offering them the opportunity to demonstrate whether they possessed the wisdom to learn from instruction, or the stubborn pride that would mark them as just another fool destined for elimination. The battle that followed revealed capabilities that exceeded Morgott's initial expectations, as the Tarnished demonstrated not merely exceptional skill with weapons and magic, but the sort of tactical flexibility that suggested genuine intelligence behind their combat techniques. Their ability to adapt to unexpected attacks and unconventional strategies spoke of experience earned through survival rather than training received in comfortable academies, the kind of hard-won knowledge that could not be purchased or inherited but had to be claimed through personal risk and sacrifice. Yet even more impressive than their martial capabilities was the way they responded to defeat, accepting the outcome of their first encounter with the sort of philosophical resilience that marked them as someone who understood the difference between temporary setbacks and permanent failures. The retreat they conducted was neither panicked flight nor sullen withdrawal, but strategic repositioning. the action of someone who viewed this initial confrontation as reconnaissance rather than decisive engagement. The promise that echoed in Morgott's parting words was both warning and prediction, an acknowledgement that this particular tarnished had demonstrated qualities that elevated them above the level of common nuisance to something approaching genuine threat. The hands of the fell Omen would indeed seek them out in the nights to come, but now their efforts would be guided by respect as much as duty, the recognition that a worthy opponent deserved the full attention of forces that had been held in reserve for truly exceptional challenges. The months that followed this initial encounter provided abundant evidence that Morgott's assessment had been accurate, as reports reached him of the Tarnished's progress through regions and challenges that had claimed countless other aspiring heroes. The methodical way they approached each obstacle, the careful attention they paid to gathering information and resources before attempting major confrontations, the strategic patience they displayed in building strength rather than rushing toward premature encounters with overwhelming opposition. All of these qualities marked them as someone who understood that true power came through preparation rather than improvisation. The cleansing of Caelid's rot-infested landscapes demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond mere combat prowess, requiring the sort of sustained effort and moral commitment that few possessed in sufficient measure to complete such thankless work. The restoration of areas that had been written off as permanently corrupted spoke to a vision of renewal that transcended the simple acquisition of power for its own sake, suggesting motivations that might prove more complex and potentially more dangerous than conventional ambition. The liberation of Rani's questline and the assistance provided to various factions throughout the realm revealed a pattern of behavior that was simultaneously admirable and deeply troubling to someone whose entire worldview was built around the necessity of maintaining established order. The Tarnished seemed to operate according to principles that valued justice and compassion above institutional stability, making decisions based on immediate moral considerations rather than long-term political consequences. This approach to problem-solving represented everything that Morgott had been trained to fear and eliminate, the sort of independent moral reasoning that could destabilize carefully maintained balances of power in pursuit of abstract ideals that took no account of the practical realities that governed complex societies. Yet the effectiveness with which these principles were applied, the consistent success that followed from decisions made according to such criteria, created uncomfortable questions about the relationship between moral action and practical results. The second manifestation of Morgott occurred when the Tarnished approached the outer defences of Leyndell itself, their arrival at the capital's gates, representing a level of achievement that placed them among the most exceptional individuals in the history of the Lands Between. The body that Morgott chose for this encounter belonged to an aged noble, whose long service to the crown had earned him the right to spend his final years in comfortable retirement, a reward that was now sacrificed to the necessities of strategic deception. The possession of this elderly form required techniques that pushed the boundaries of what illusion magic could accomplish, transforming willing flesh into an instrument that could channel capabilities far beyond what its natural limitations should have allowed. The noble's consciousness was not destroyed but temporarily displaced, his awareness pushed into dormancy while his physical form became a vessel for powers that operated according to principles he could never have understood during his active years of service. The psychological impact of using such methods was not lost on Morgott, whose own experience of being treated as an instrument rather than a person gave him intimate understanding of the moral complexities involved in reducing human beings to tools for the accomplishment of political objectives. The fact that the noble had volunteered for this service, had offered his body willingly in defense of the kingdom he loved, provided some comfort, but did not entirely eliminate the ethical concerns that such practices raised. The battle that took place among the ruins and defensive structures outside Lanedale's main gates revealed the full extent of the Tarnished's development since their first encounter at Stormvale, demonstrating growth in both capability and understanding that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of their potential. The ease with which they adapted to Morgott's evolved tactics spoke to a learning capacity that was both impressive and deeply concerning to someone whose security depended upon the predictability of potential threats. The defeat of this second manifestation represented more than merely another successful engagement for the Tarnished. It marked their transition from promising challenger to existential threat, someone whose continued progress could no longer be dismissed as the temporary success of a particularly capable individual. The casual way in which they overcame defenses that had been designed to stop the most exceptional opponents suggested reserves of power and determination that had not yet been fully revealed. The callous abandonment of the noble's body after its usefulness had ended reflected practical necessities that Morgott understood better than most. Yet, the sight of the elderly man's corpse lying forgotten among the debris of battle created emotional responses that his years of spiritual discipline could not entirely suppress. The knowledge that he had used another human being as expendable material in service of his defensive strategy added weight to the already heavy burden of moral compromises that his position required. The final approach to the Erd Tree itself represented the culmination of everything the Tarnished had accomplished during their journey through the Shattered Realm, the moment when theory would be tested against the ultimate reality of divine authority and cosmic order. The golden thrones that surrounded the great tree served as monuments to the demigods who should have occupied them, empty seats that bore witness to the scope of the catastrophe that had befallen the royal family and the institutions they had been meant to preserve. The sight of these vacant thrones stirred complex emotions in Morgott's consciousness, reminding him simultaneously of the siblings whose deaths or transformations had made his own elevation possible, and of the loneliness that had defined his entire existence as the sole remaining guardian of principles that had been abandoned by those who should have been their greatest champions. The knowledge that Mog's throne stood among the others, that his twin brother had chosen revolution over restoration, created pain that spiritual discipline could contain, but never entirely eliminate. The decision to reveal his true identity and engage the Tarnished in direct combat represented the abandonment of strategies that had served him well throughout his reign as the Veiled Monarch, acknowledging through action what his words made explicit, that conventional methods of defense and deterrence had proved inadequate to the challenge that now confronted him. The staff that had disguised his cursed blood for so many years was finally allowed to resume its true form, the blade emerging from concealment like a serpent awakening from hibernation. The weapon that manifested from his sealed Omen essence carried within its shifting substance all the pain and power that had been suppressed through decades of self-denial and spiritual discipline. A blade that existed at the intersection of order and chaos, control and release, duty and desire. The hues that flowed through its surface spoke of natures that had been forced into artificial harmony, elements of his identity that had been held apart through constant effort, now allowed to merge and interact in ways that created both beauty and terror. The battle that followed was unlike any that Morgott had fought during his years as either Morgott or the Hidden King, a contest that demanded not merely tactical skill and supernatural power, but the willingness to risk everything that he had built and preserved in defense of principles that might not survive regardless of the outcome. The Tarnished who faced him represented more than simply another challenger to be eliminated. They embodied the possibility of genuine change, of transformation that might lead toward forms of order that had not previously been imagined. The gradual failure of his strength during this final confrontation carried with it the recognition that his time as guardian and protector was drawing to its inevitable close, that the strategies and sacrifices that had preserved the Golden Order through its period of greatest crisis were no longer sufficient to meet the challenges that the future would bring. The grace that abandoned him in his moment of greatest need served as final confirmation of what he had always known but never acknowledged, that his value to the greater will had always been purely instrumental, his worth measured entirely by his utility rather than his devotion. The blood that stained the golden thrones as his Omen nature reasserted itself represented more than merely physical evidence of his defeat. It served as symbolic contamination of sacred space, proof that even the most carefully maintained boundaries between pure and corrupt could be breached when subjected to sufficient pressure. The shame that overwhelmed him in these final moments was not merely personal but cosmic, the recognition that his very existence had always been a form of pollution that no amount of service could entirely cleanse. The threats that he directed toward the tarnished in his dying moments were born not of malice but of genuine concern for what their victory might ultimately cost. Warnings based on intimate knowledge of the burdens and compromises that authority inevitably demanded from those who claimed it. The failure that he predicted would be their destiny reflected not vindictive wishes, but hard-earned understanding of the relationship between noble intentions and practical results, between the desire to do good and the ability to navigate the moral complexities that such desires created. The fading of his Omen features as death approached represented a final mercy or cruelty, depending on one's perspective on the relationship between authentic identity and acceptable appearance. The human essence that remained when the supernatural elements of his nature had departed suggested either the possibility of redemption through death or the tragedy of a life spent denying fundamental aspects of the self in service of principles that offered no reciprocal acceptance. The body that lay at the foot of the Erd tree, unrecognized and unmourned by the subjects who had benefited from his protection, served as monument to the costs of perfect service and the loneliness of those who sacrifice everything for causes that can never love them in return. The king who had ruled from shadows while others claimed credit for his victories had finally stepped into the light, only to discover that illumination brought not recognition but the harsh clarity of ultimate judgment and irreversible loss. The circular chamber that lay beneath the shattered throne room of Hyrule Castle had witnessed the rise and fall of countless ages, its ancient stones carved with symbols that predated even the most venerable records of the Sheikah's accumulated wisdom. Here, in this observatory that existed at the intersection of earth and sky, mortal ambition and divine authority, the final confrontation between the last guardian of the Golden Order and the ultimate expression of its corruption would unfold with all the terrible inevitability of a cosmic catastrophe that had been building for millennia. The fall through layers of stone and history had carried both combatants past the merely political dimensions of their conflict into realms where the struggle between order and chaos took on meanings that transcended individual personality or even dynastic ambition. This was no longer simply a battle between a tarnished seeking power and an Omen king defending his throne, but rather the collision of two incompatible visions of what reality itself should be allowed to become. The chamber's walls were covered with astronomical calculations and star charts that spoke of the ancient Sheikah's attempts to understand their place within the cosmic order, their careful observations and mathematical analyses representing humanity's highest aspirations toward knowledge and comprehension of forces that operated on scales beyond normal mortal understanding. The irony that this temple to rational inquiry would serve as the arena for a battle between supernatural forces was not lost on either participant, though neither had leisure to contemplate such philosophical complexities while engaged in mortal combat. Calamity Ganon, stripped of the mechanical shell that had contained its essence throughout the long centuries of imprisonment and corruption, now revealed itself in a form that defied easy categorization or comfortable analysis. This was malice given physical expression, hatred made manifest in flesh that seemed to exist partially outside the normal constraints of space and time. Its movements possessed the fluid unpredictability of liquid fire, while its attacks carried the focused intensity of accumulated rage that had been building pressure for generations beyond counting. The creature's crown, that mockery of royal authority which bore the symbols and colors of the Gerudo people while serving as a monument to everything that their noble traditions had been corrupted into becoming, pulsed with energies that seemed to draw power from the very act of destruction itself. Each successful strike, each wound inflicted upon its opponent, appeared to strengthen rather than weaken the entity that had once been Ganondorf the King, but had long since transcended such limited categories of identity and purpose. The weapons it wielded were extensions of its own corrupted essence, rather than separate tools, manifestations of destructive intent that could assume whatever form the moment's tactical requirements might demand. Blades of crystallized malice emerged from its limbs with the casual ease of a predator extending claws, while energy beams erupted from its core with the precision of a master archer whose target could never hope to escape or deflect the projectiles directed toward their destruction. Yet for all its supernatural advantages, for all the power it had accumulated through centuries of feeding upon hatred and corruption, Calamity Ganon found itself facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded its calculations and whose determination transcended normal understanding of what mortal will could accomplish under such impossible circumstances. The Master Sword in Link's hands was more than merely a weapon forged from divine materials and blessed by ancient magic. It was the physical embodiment of principles that stood in absolute opposition to everything the calamity represented. The blade sang with harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond the merely physical, each strike creating ripples in the fabric of reality itself that weakened the bonds holding the corrupted entity together. The sacred light that emanated from its edge was not simply illumination but active force that sought out darkness and dissolved it through contact rather than combat, transformation rather than destruction. The battle that raged through the observatory's ancient chambers was simultaneously intensely personal and utterly impersonal, a clash between individuals who had been shaped by forces beyond their control, while serving as representatives of cosmic principles that had been in conflict since the beginning of time itself. Every sword stroke carried within it the accumulated weight of all the choices and sacrifices that had led to this moment, while every defensive maneuver reflected strategies that had been developing across multiple lifetimes and incarnations. The architectural marvels that surrounded them bore witness to this ultimate confrontation with the stoic endurance of stone that had outlasted empires and would continue to exist long after the immediate concerns of mortal ambition had been resolved one way or another. The astronomical instruments continued their patient observations of celestial movements that proceeded according to laws more fundamental than the outcome of any terrestrial conflict, while the carved symbols maintained their silent record of knowledge that transcended the temporary arrangements of political power. Yet, even as the battle's fury threatened to reduce the ancient chamber to rubble, even as energies that could reshape continents were unleashed within spaces that had been designed for quiet contemplation and scholarly research, the essential character of the place seemed to impose its own influence upon the proceedings. The pursuit of understanding, that had motivated the observatory's construction still echoed through its corridors, creating an atmosphere that encouraged analysis and comprehension rather than blind fury or desperate survival instinct. This environment served to remind both combatants that their conflict was part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond their individual circumstances, a recurring cycle of creation and destruction that had played out across ages and would continue to do so regardless of who emerged victorious from this particular engagement. The knowledge that they were actors in a cosmic drama rather than the authors of their own destinies provided a strange form of perspective that allowed for strategic thinking even in the midst of life or death combat. The gradual shift in the battle's momentum became apparent as the sacred power of the Master Sword began to overcome the supernatural resilience that had allowed Calamity Ganon to survive and regenerate through countless previous encounters with forces that should have been sufficient to destroy it permanently. The corruption that held its physical form together started to fracture under repeated exposure to energies that were specifically designed to cleanse rather than simply defeat, to restore proper order rather than merely eliminate threatening chaos. The creature's attacks became more desperate and less coordinated as vital systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries began to break down under the sustained assault of powers that targeted the fundamental principles underlying its existence. The confident precision that had characterized its early maneuvers gave way to increasingly frantic attempts to land decisive blows before its structural integrity deteriorated beyond the point of recovery. Yet even as victory seemed to draw closer with each successful strike, even as the accumulated damage began to tell upon an enemy that had previously seemed invulnerable to conventional assault, Link found himself forced to confront the disturbing realization that destroying Calamity Ganon's current manifestation might not be sufficient to end the threat it represented. The entity's essence seemed to exist on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, its physical form serving merely as the most visible expression of forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of life and death. The final series of exchanges that brought the battle to its climax required Link to draw upon reserves of strength and determination that he had not known he possessed, calling upon not merely his own accumulated skills and experience, but the spiritual legacy of all those who had wielded the Master Sword before him across the turning of ages. The blade's power reached its full potential only when channeled through someone whose commitment to the principles it embodied was absolute and uncompromising, whose willingness to sacrifice personal welfare for the greater good matched the sword's own dedication to its cosmic purpose. The strike that finally shattered Calamity Ganon's physical shell carried within it more than mere kinetic force or even supernatural energy. It was an act of pure intention, given material expression, the crystallization of centuries of hope and faith and determination into a moment of action that could not be turned aside or deflected through any application of opposing will. The explosion of light that followed seemed to illuminate not merely the observatory's ancient chambers, but dimensions of reality that normal perception could never access, revealing the true scope of what had been at stake in this confrontation. Yet even as the corrupted form began to dissolve into component elements that could be scattered and eventually neutralized, even as victory seemed to have been achieved through courage and skill, and the intervention of powers greater than mortal understanding, the battle's true significance was only beginning to reveal itself. The destruction of Calamity Ganon's physical manifestation had been merely the preliminary phase of a confrontation that would continue on planes of existence where different rules applied and different forms of conflict became necessary. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the defeat of the ancient evil that had corrupted it, the carved symbols glowing with renewed vitality, as if the removal of the calamity's influence had restored connections that had been severed for far too long. The astronomical instruments resumed their proper functions with mechanical precision that spoke of craftsmanship that had been designed to endure such temporary disruptions, while the walls themselves appeared to straighten and strengthen as structural damage inflicted by supernatural combat began to repair itself through processes that operated according to principles more ancient than the corruption that had threatened to destroy them. The silence that followed the calamity's apparent destruction was more profound than mere absence of sound, encompassing a quality of peace that suggested fundamental changes in the nature of reality itself, rather than simply the end of immediate physical danger. Yet this tranquility carried within it undertones of incompleteness, hints that the victory achieved through such tremendous effort and sacrifice was only partial, that greater challenges awaited resolution before true restoration could be accomplished. The awareness that Princess Zelda remained imprisoned somewhere beyond the reach of normal rescue efforts cast shadows across what should have been a moment of pure triumph, reminding Link that personal success in combat was meaningless if it could not be translated into the salvation of those he had sworn to protect. The voice that had guided him throughout his journey, that had provided encouragement during his darkest moments and wisdom during his greatest challenges, still called to him from across dimensional barriers that conventional understanding could not penetrate. The transportation that carried him from the collapsing observatory to the fields outside Hyrule Castle operated according to principles that transcended normal space and time, moving him not merely from one physical location to another, but from one phase of his destiny to the next. The familiar landscape that materialized around him bore the scars of ancient battles while simultaneously showing signs of renewal and regeneration that spoke of resilience that ran deeper than surface appearance might suggest. The grass beneath his feet was the same that had witnessed countless conflicts and celebrations throughout the kingdom's long history, soil that had been watered with both tears of joy and blood of sacrifice until it had become sacred ground in ways that official consecration could never achieve. The air carried scents of growing things and distant rain, promises of seasons that would continue their eternal cycle, regardless of the political arrangements that might govern the human settlements scattered across the realm. Yet the most significant aspect of this transformed environment was not what had changed, but what remained constant. The underlying beauty and potential that had survived every catastrophe and continued to offer hope for renewal and restoration, despite the magnitude of what had been lost. The kingdom that spread around him was broken but not defeated, scarred but not destroyed, ready to begin the long journey toward healing once the immediate crisis had been resolved. The dark beast that emerged from the dissipating energies of the destroyed calamity represented something far more primal and fundamental than the mechanically enhanced entity that had been defeated in the observatory's ancient chambers. This was Ganon reduced to his essential nature, stripped of all the accumulated layers of corruption and technological augmentation that had obscured his true character during the long centuries of imprisonment and transformation. The form that manifested in Hyrule Field was that of a creature that seemed to embody the very concept of destructive force given physical expression, a being whose existence threatened not merely political stability or individual lives, but the basic principles that allowed reality to maintain its coherent structure. This was chaos incarnate, entropy made manifest, the promise of an ending that would leave nothing behind except the memory of what had once been possible before everything collapsed into primordial darkness. The battle that commenced across the rolling fields where peaceful agriculture had once flourished represented the ultimate test of everything that Link had learned and become during his long journey toward this moment of final light. Confrontation, the skills he had developed, the allies he had gathered, the weapons he had claimed, the wisdom he had accumulated, all of these would be required to face an enemy that existed partially outside the normal constraints of mortal combat. The bow of light that materialized in his hands drew its power not from any physical source, but from the accumulated faith and hope of all those who had maintained their belief in the possibility of restoration, despite evidence that suggested such optimism was merely self-deception. Princess Zelda's voice, reaching across dimensional barriers through sheer force of will and desperation, provided not merely tactical guidance but spiritual reinforcement that enabled him to continue fighting, even when conventional logic suggested that victory was impossible. The arrows that flew from this sacred weapon carried within them more than concentrated energy or divine blessing. They were physical manifestations of the principle that some things were worth preserving, regardless of the cost required to protect them. Each shot represented a choice to affirm life over death, order over chaos, hope over despair, even when such affirmations seemed to fly in the face of overwhelming evidence that darkness was destined to triumph over light. The final arrow that found its mark in the dark beast's core carried within it not merely the accumulated power of divine weapons and supernatural blessing, but the crystallized essence of every act of courage and compassion that had been performed throughout the kingdom's history. It was simultaneously the end of one story and the beginning of another, the conclusion of a cycle of destruction that had lasted for generations and the first moment of a new age whose character would be determined by choices yet to be made. The light that erupted from the creature's death was not simply the absence of darkness, but the positive presence of possibilities that had been held in suspension during the long night of the kingdom's suffering. It illuminated not merely the physical landscape, but dimensions of potential that had been hidden beneath layers of accumulated tragedy and loss, revealing opportunities for renewal that had always existed, but had been obscured by the immediate demands of survival and resistance. The silence that settled over Hyrule Field in the moments following Dark Beast Ganon's final destruction was unlike any quietude that the ancient landscape had ever known, a profound stillness that seemed to emanate from the very heart of creation itself and spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped into perfectly calm water. This was not merely the absence of battle cries and clashing weapons, not simply the end of supernatural energies tearing through the fabric of reality, but something far deeper and more fundamental. The peace that comes when a wound that has festered for generations is finally allowed to begin healing. The golden light that had erupted from the dark beast's core, as it dissolved into component elements, continued to hang in the air like suspended starlight, each mote carrying within it the accumulated hopes and dreams of countless souls who had lived and died believing that someday, somehow, the darkness that had plagued their world would finally be banished by forces of restoration and renewal. The radiance did not simply illuminate the physical landscape, but seemed to penetrate into dimensions of existence that mortal senses could barely perceive, revealing layers of reality that had been hidden beneath centuries of accumulated corruption and despair. Princess Zelda emerged from this luminous chrysalis not as the frightened girl who had struggled to awaken her sacred powers a century ago, but as a being whose divine nature had been refined and purified through suffering until it blazed with an intensity that made the sun itself seem dim by comparison. Her form seemed to exist at the intersection of mortal flesh and divine essence, simultaneously human enough to inspire recognition and love, yet touched by powers so vast and eternal that her very presence transformed the space around her into something approaching sacred ground. The wind that stirred her hair as she stood in the midst of that field of fading battle carried with it the breath of possibility itself, the promise of seasons yet to come, and harvests yet to be gathered by hands that had not yet been born, but whose work would be blessed by the freedom that had been purchased through such tremendous sacrifice. Her eyes held depths that spoke of visions encompassing not merely what was or what had been, but what could be if the right choices were made in the crucial moments that would determine the character of the age to come. The first words that passed between them after a century of separation carried weight that transcended their simple syllables, each phrase loaded with meanings that could never be fully expressed through mere language, but which resonated through dimensions of understanding that operated beyond the normal constraints of verbal communication. The question she posed about his memories was not merely curious inquiry, but recognition that the man who stood before her was simultaneously the hero she had known and loved, and someone transformed by experiences and losses that had shaped him into something both familiar and utterly changed. Link's response, when it came, carried within its carefully chosen words the acknowledgement that memory was more than mere accumulation of facts and experiences, that the bonds connecting souls across time and circumstance could transcend the artificial divisions created by magical healing or supernatural transformation. The recognition that flickered in his eyes spoke of connections that existed on levels deeper than conscious recollection, spiritual realities that no amount of physical damage or temporal separation could entirely sever. The body that lay at the foot of the Erd tree, abandoned and unmourned by the very subjects whose welfare had defined every moment of his existence, served as a monument to the costs of absolute devotion and the loneliness of those who sacrifice everything in service of principles that can offer no reciprocal affection. Morgott's corpse bore none of the Omen features that had marked him as cursed and unworthy throughout his life, his death having stripped away the supernatural characteristics that had justified his exclusion while revealing the fundamentally human essence that had always existed beneath the surface of his monstrous appearance. The transformation that occurred in death was neither reward for faithful service nor cruel final irony, but simply the natural result of spiritual forces that had been held in artificial tension throughout his existence, finally achieving the balance that had been impossible during his lifetime. The features that had caused so much suffering and inspired so much hatred were revealed to have been temporary impositions upon a nature that was far more complex and nuanced than surface appearance had ever suggested. That no citizens of Lanedale noticed their king's passing, that no courtiers or servants stumbled upon the body of the ruler who had protected them through the darkest period in their kingdom's history, spoke to the profound isolation that had defined Morgott's entire reign as the veiled monarch. The illusions and deceptions that had allowed him to rule without revealing his true nature had been so complete, so carefully maintained, that even his death could pass without recognition or acknowledgement from those who had benefited most from his sacrifices. The irony that the most effective king in Lanedale's history should die as anonymously as the humblest peasant reflected the essential tragedy of a life lived entirely in service to others, where personal recognition and individual happiness had been sacrificed so completely on the altar of institutional loyalty that death brought relief rather than loss. The crown that had never truly been his to wear, the authority that had been granted only as long as it served others' purposes, the love that had been given freely but never reciprocated, all of these had finally been surrendered to forces beyond political manipulation or personal control. Yet in that moment, when discovery seemed impossible and recognition appeared forever denied, when the greatest servant of the Golden Order seemed destined to fade into obscurity as complete as his years of hidden service, footsteps approached through the devastated halls of the castle, with the measured pace of one who moved with purpose despite the weight of years and accumulated sorrow. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, whose banishment had marked the beginning of his son's period of greatest isolation, had returned to the lands between, bearing grace that had been restored through trials and transformations that had refined his own understanding of duty and sacrifice. The sight that greeted him at the foot of the Erd tree struck with a force that transcended mere visual recognition, reaching into regions of paternal instinct and emotional memory that had been suppressed but never destroyed during the long years of exile and separation. The body that lay crumpled among the ancient roots bore features that had been hidden beneath Omen corruption for so long that Godfrey had almost forgotten the human child who had once existed beneath the supernatural afflictions that had beset justified his abandonment. The moment of recognition transformed the warrior who had conquered kingdoms and humbled gods into something far more vulnerable and infinitely more human. A father confronting the ultimate cost of choices made in service of principles that had seemed unquestionably correct when viewed from the comfortable distance of political necessity. The tears that fell from eyes that had witnessed countless battles without flinching spoke of regrets that no amount of subsequent achievement could balance or justify. The act of lifting Morgott's still form, of cradling the son he had been forced to abandon in arms that had grown strong through conquest but had never been allowed to offer comfort or protection when they were most needed, represented a form of communication that transcended any words that might have been spoken during their brief lifetime of separation. The gentleness with which those battle-hardened hands arranged the lifeless limbs spoke of love that had been suppressed by political necessity but had never been entirely extinguished. Serosh, the great lion that had served as both companion and restraint throughout Godfrey's years of exile and transformation, added his voice to this moment of mourning with a roar that seemed to contain within its primal sound all the rage and sorrow that civilized speech could never adequately express. The beast's cry echoed through the empty halls of the castle like a lament for innocence lost and potential unfulfilled, a recognition that some wounds could never heal and some losses could never be recovered, regardless of what victories might be achieved in their aftermath. The fading that began as Godfrey's touch lingered upon his son's still form was not the gradual dissolution of merely physical matter, but the transformation of accumulated suffering into something that might yet serve purposes greater than the individual pain that had created it. Morgott's essence, refined through decades of self-denial and purified through absolute devotion to principles that had offered him nothing in return, began to merge with the guidance of grace itself, becoming part of the divine current that would guide future heroes toward their own moments of testing and triumph. This final metamorphosis represented neither reward nor punishment, but simply the natural progression of a soul that had been so thoroughly aligned with cosmic purpose that death became not ending but transformation, not loss but translation into forms of service that transcended the limitations of individual mortality. The man who had lived his entire existence as instrument and tool would continue that function on planes of reality where different forms of influence became possible. The greater will's utilization of Morgott's transformed essence as motivation and guidance for his father's coming battle revealed the essentially pragmatic nature of divine providence, the way that even the most perfect devotion and complete self-sacrifice would ultimately be valued only for their utility in accomplishing larger objectives that operated according to logic beyond mortal comprehension. The love that had sustained Morgott through his years of isolation and abandonment became just another resource to be deployed in service of cosmic purposes that had no room for sentiment or individual consideration. Yet perhaps there was something approaching mercy in this final transformation, a recognition that the man who had given everything in service of others might find more peace in continued service than in the rest that others might have chosen as their eternal reward. The guidance that his essence would provide to future heroes would carry within it all the wisdom earned through suffering, all the understanding purchased through sacrifice, all the love that had been offered freely despite constant rejection and abandonment. The moral complexity of Morgott's legacy defied simple categorization or comfortable judgment, encompassing actions that were simultaneously noble and terrible, choices that preserved civilization while perpetuating systems of oppression, love that expressed itself through forms of service that caused suffering to those it claimed to protect. The king who had used his own people as disposable weapons while maintaining perfect loyalty to institutions that despised his very existence represented contradictions that could never be resolved through conventional ethical analysis. The question of whether his actions deserved condemnation or admiration, whether his sacrifices had been meaningful or futile, whether his devotion had been saintly or pathological, remained unanswerable because the circumstances that had shaped his choices existed outside normal frameworks of moral evaluation. The man who had been born cursed into a system that had no place for him, who had transformed that curse into the foundation of perfect service, who had found meaning in rejection and purpose in abandonment, belonged to categories of experience that transcended ordinary understanding. The forgiveness that some might offer, or the judgment that others might pronounce, seemed equally irrelevant when measured against the simple fact of what he had accomplished and endured. The walls of Lendel had remained unbreached throughout the war that had shattered kingdoms and reduced gods to madness. The Golden Order had survived its period of greatest crisis, and the possibility of restoration had been preserved through trials that would have destroyed any institution less carefully guarded and passionately defended. Whether the price paid for these achievements had been justified, whether alternative approaches might have accomplished similar results with less suffering, whether the systems preserved had been worthy of such absolute devotion, were questions that each observer would have to answer according to their own understanding of the relationship between individual welfare and collective good, personal happiness and institutional stability, love and duty. The empty throne that would forever bear witness to Morgott's reign stood as monument to possibilities that had been simultaneously fulfilled and denied, to potential that had been realized through its own negation, to love that had achieved its highest expression through complete self-abnegation. The illusions that had allowed him to rule without revealing his nature had finally faded, leaving behind only the stark truth of what had been accomplished and what it had cost to accomplish it. The guidance that his transformed essence would provide to future generations would carry within it not answers but questions, not certainty, but the recognition that the most profound choices always involved impossible decisions between competing goods, that the greatest love sometimes required the greatest sacrifice, and that the highest service might demand the surrender of everything that made service meaningful in conventional terms. The man who had lived with the heart of a lord in the body of an Omen, who had found honor in dishonor and meaning in meaninglessness, who had loved what could never love him and served what would never accept him, had finally achieved the only form of peace that his nature and circumstances had ever made possible. The peace of becoming something larger than individual identity, something that could continue to serve and protect and guide, even when the person who had made such service possible was gone forever. In the silence that settled over the empty throne room, in the shadows that gathered around monuments to forgotten sacrifice, in the guidance that would lead future heroes toward their own moments of testing and triumph, Morgott's story continued, not as memory but as living influence, not as ended tragedy but as ongoing possibility, not as concluded failure but as eternal question about the nature of love and duty, and the prices that both demand from those who would serve, causes greater than themselves. The honor that he had found in circumstances that would have driven others to despair or rebellion remained intact, neither diminished by death nor validated by recognition, but simply existing as fact that needed no external confirmation or denial to maintain its reality and meaning. And so ends the tale of Morgott, the Omen King, whose love burned brightest for that which cast him into shadow. In a world that demanded he hate himself, he chose devotion. In a system that rejected his very existence, he found purpose through service. His was not a story of redemption, for he never believed he needed redeeming, only the chance to prove his worth through sacrifice. The golden light of the Erd Tree continues to shine over the lands between, though its glow is dimmer now, touched by the memory of one who loved it more than life itself. Morgott's throne sits empty, his illusions faded, but his vigil continues in the guidance he became, a final act of service that transcends death itself. Sleep now, knowing that even in the darkest of stories, there exists a nobility that cannot be extinguished by circumstance or cruelty. Let Morgott's unwavering faith remind you that love, even unrequited, has the power to transform suffering into purpose, and rejection into the deepest forms of devotion. The king is dead, but his honor remains eternal, written in the very stones of Lendel and the gentle guidance that leads heroes toward their destiny.